Now this next point can really apply to anyone. It makes a huge difference in your interior design. Today's video was made possible by Benjamin Moore. A very underrated perk about Benjamin Moore stores is the fact that they're locally owned businesses. Not many people know that. The Benjamin Moore shop down the street from you, it's not a corporate paint store that has no soul. These are small businesses that provide you with passionate service that the big box stores just can't compete with. The Paint People is actually owned by an amazing family that I've had the pleasure of knowing for almost half my life at this point. And there's just something special about supporting your friends and your neighbors, and most importantly, your local experts that really know their stuff when it comes to paint. Go Benjamin Moore, allowing you to shop local. Now, just because you're working with a neutral color palette doesn't mean it needs to be boring. I've always been a huge fan of neutrals for a variety of reasons, mainly because they're pretty nice to work with. They're versatile, usable in a lot of situations, but sometimes I do agree that it's a bit hard to dress them up and help them feel a bit special. Well, thankfully, I came across an amazing article on architecturaldigest.com, which is an amazing resource for all things design. And this is all about exciting neutral color palette ideas that aren't boring. So the first tip we're looking at is keeping it airy. So not necessarily going with airy sky blue as your neutral. The idea here is not to overcrowd your space, and not just on the floors, but on the walls themselves. As you can see in this example that they give you, great photo, Amy. We have a beautiful sunroom here that I'm very jealous of, and the windows are actually untreated. They're completely open and bare, and I think it's because this house has the luxury of being surrounded by beautiful foliage and greenery. So maybe there's not as much of a concern of people kind of peeking in, but then in terms of what's in the room, there's not a ton of stuff. It's not completely empty and minimal either, but you have a couch, you have a chair, you have a table, a stool, a tiny adorable little tricycle. Enough to pique your interest, but not muddy the whole space. This next example is all about form, which is not something that people think about very often. One of the biggest piece of advice when working with neutrals in general is to add in texture, because the colors aren't going to do a ton to differentiate themselves when it comes to neutrals, but how they can sort of look different is different textures, different materials, things like that. But you can also work in different shapes. There's a lot of fun shapes happening in here, the nice rounded edges on the chairs and that little console table. And of course you have that light fixture, which is essentially the same white as the ceiling, but its form is extremely unique and it captures your attention without being bright red or something. It's really, really cool. So by exploring different shapes and forms, you can still work within the neutral color palette, but have some fun, add some interest in a lot of really cool ways. And it gives you an excuse to buy some fun stuff. Okay, now we're talking about some color here. Layer in different hues. And this essentially is just talking about different neutrals working together. Because the fact of the matter is, a neutral when it comes to paint colors can really be any color technically, but the way that most people define them are more muted, desaturated colors that are a bit softer, not quite as in your face, but just feel a little more toned down. And in this example, we have two different neutrals in adjacent rooms. So I guess this picture is being framed by maybe a hallway, and it has this sort of sandy color, this warm, almost orangey beige, and then it leads into this living space that's more of a traditional off-white, a little yellowy, a bit greeny, a bit greenish maybe. Just because you're working with neutrals doesn't mean you need to stick with one boring builder's beige. Just in some dark, because a lot of people forget that dark colors can be neutral too. And oftentimes when you look at something like a charcoal gray on, let's say, the Sherwin-Williams website, it's going to tell you that it's part of the neutral color family. Because even though it's dynamic and dark and really noticeable, it doesn't have a clear color hue, which makes it neutral feeling. Oftentimes you'll see grays being paired with off blacks or charcoal grays, or light beiges being paired with taupes. Very different in terms of darkness, but still neutral feeling. This next one is a little bit confusing as a color theorist myself. Remember, color is a neutral. And that statement is completely true, because you can have any color be the main color in a space, and that becomes the neutral or the baseline. But in this example, what they're saying is you can have these nearly neutral colors. You can have a room that's based on green, but still feel neutral, because you're picking maybe a sage green that is combined with gray to make it a little more dusty feeling, or more of a pastel, or just a muted version of green. And it doesn't need to be green. It can be virtually any color, just as long as you're going with those more relaxed, subdued versions of any of the color hues. Create a skyline. Even though this is Architectural Digest, they're obviously not telling you to just build a bunch of office buildings. The important thing here is experiment with height and levels. Levels are very important. So this example is really cool because everything's arranged in a really thoughtful way. You have a neutral palette through and through, but different neutrals. The black bowl, the browny beige sandy vase, the rounded edges, and then you have just your straight up books happening as well. Light, dark, mid-tone, it's all being accounted for. And what better way to experiment with levels in your design than next to a staircase, which obviously takes you to the next level of your house. Add hints of glam. Add a trickle of gold here and there, basically. Even in a room that's based on creams and beiges, you can have those little pops here and there that just give you that little bit of chicness, a little bit of fun. The easiest ways to include glam is to have maybe subtle brushed gold accents, a bit of copper, some black. Those high contrast standout features that in larger doses may be a bit too much for your neutral palette, but just those little touches here and there could be the ticket. Employ a couple of unexpected pieces. I'm not sure about this one because when I think of an unexpected piece, I just think of something that doesn't fit in, doesn't belong. Not always the case. And it is fun to deviate from your more predictable furniture, let's say, but unless you're into eclecticism, if you've accumulated a lot of really interesting pieces and you don't really care about the design style, or you're just having your own sort of thing, then I think this applies to you. But if you do have a really interesting, unique piece that you want to show off, why not? Now, this next point can really apply to anyone. It makes a huge difference in your interior designs. Bring in mirrors. No matter what color palette you're using, whether it's neutral or not, mirrors are amazing. They're obviously very practical and you can look at them when you need to check your hair and all that. But more importantly, they're going to give the illusion that your room and your space is bigger than it actually is. It's going to reflect more light back in the space as well. And it's an awesome opportunity to add some accents because you can get some really fun, awesome mirrors that can be a statement and also have that amazing practical advantage as well. I'll leave the article down below if you want to dive in a little bit deeper. And like I mentioned, if you want way more of these reaction style videos, we have a lot of them already on our Patreon right now. So link down below to check that out. But in terms of YouTube videos, here's another one right over here.